Welcome to the Bench Report, where we talk about the big stuff debated in the UK Parliament, past and present. The really consequential debates. And there's no debate more consequential, I'd argue, than what went down 5 years ago this month, right as the world was about to go into lockdown. Pretty fascinating to look back, don't you think? To see if we've, learned anything from history, right?
Today we're taking a deep dive into the second reading of the coronavirus bill. March 23, 2020, House of Commons, a bill that gave the UK government, let's just say, a whole lot of power, unprecedented power, really, for peacetime. We're going to dig into the main discussions, what the MPs were concerned about on that day.
So you sent us this transcript. Probably want to get a sense of how Parliament initially reacted, right? What were they worried about back then? And, of course, how all of this led to those, extraordinary measures that followed.
The second reading, just to clarify, that's a crucial step. It's where MPs get to debate the core ideas of a bill before they get into the nitty-gritty details.
Makes sense. So our mission today, to pull out the most important, maybe even some surprising insights from all of this, to give you a clear picture of those early days when everything changed. And speaking of things changing, Matt Hancock, the health secretary at the time, he didn't hold back, did he?
Not at all. He came right out and called coronavirus the biggest public health emergency in a century. Talk about setting the tone. But what's really interesting is that he stressed the need for extraordinary measures, the kind we'd never seen in peacetime. So this wasn't just like adjusting existing procedures. This was signaling a whole new ballgame. I think the main takeaway here is that even at the very top levels of government, they realized right away that the old ways weren't going to cut it.
It's like a nation prepping for war, even though it was a health crisis?
Yeah, I see what you mean. And the fact that all four UK governments agreed on this bill, that just shows how serious they considered the threat and how badly they needed to be united. When Hancock said they were armed with the power to fight the virus, with everything that we have, that speaks volumes about the sheer scale of the challenge, at least as they saw it.
He also made it clear, though, that these powers, they wouldn't last forever. 2 years initially, but then that amendment for a 6-month review, it seemed like they were trying to reassure everyone.
Exactly. That focus on the measures being strictly temporary and being able to switch certain powers on or off, individually, that was key to address any worries about, overreach. What we see in this early debate is that real tension, that balance they had to find between taking decisive action and making sure Parliament stayed involved, even in a crisis.
Let's get into the specifics. One of the biggest things that MPs brought up right away was, could the NHS actually handle this? The lack of PPE, that was a huge worry from the get-go.
Absolutely. Kevin Brennan from Labour, he went straight to the point. Did frontline staff have enough PPE, and how was testing going? It wasn't theoretical. It was about the actual safety of healthcare workers right there on the front lines. This early debate really exposes that gap, between what the government was saying and what NHS staff were actually facing day to day. A real vulnerability, and it affected the initial pandemic response in a big way.
And Hancock's response, talking about distribution challenges and bringing in the military, that really highlights how complicated things were logistically at the beginning. Setting up a hotline and an email for staff to report shortages, that's almost like they were scrambling, to figure out what was really happening on the ground.
It's striking, isn't it? Hancock saying the equipment is there, we have it, but then you have MPs like Wes Streeting talking about London hospital staff thinking about walking out because they don't have basic PPE or even hand sanitizer. That disconnect shows just how tough it was to turn all those resources into actual support for the front lines.
Mark Pritchard, he asked directly, when are we going to test those intensive care staff? It just shows how urgent it was, the need to protect those most at risk and the people we needed most to fight this thing.
Exactly. And Jonathan Ashworth brought up what the Republic of Ireland was doing, those community testing facilities. He was basically saying, hey, maybe other countries are doing this better, faster. Makes you wonder if the UK could have learned from those examples earlier on.
And then you have Jeremy Hunt, the former health secretary, weighing in. That adds a lot of weight to the argument, right? He was all for making more PPE here at home, and he really pushed for testing and contact tracing, like what some Asian countries were doing successfully. And that story he told about PPE meant for Wiltshire being delayed until April 9th. It paints a pretty grim picture of those logistical hurdles, doesn't it?
Yeah, Hunt's input is really valuable because of his background. He was basically saying that PPE testing and contact tracing, they all had to work together. That became a big debate throughout the whole pandemic, and the fact that he pointed to the Asia where they were having success, that raises the question, could the UK have been more proactive about testing from the start?
So then the debate shifted, right? It became about this balance, this tricky balance between keeping people safe and respecting everyone's freedoms. So Edward Lee was one of the first to say, hold on, this power to force people into isolation who haven't even broken the law, that's a bit much.
So Edward's point goes to the heart of it, one of the core ideas of democracy, protecting individual liberties, this power to isolate people. That's a big restriction on their freedom. And him pushing for Parliament to be involved in any decision to renew these powers, that was a crucial early challenge to how far this bill could go. What we see here is that classic tension in democracies. How do you act quickly in a crisis, but still protect freedoms and make sure Parliament has a say? This debate really exposed those anxieties about giving the state so much power, even if it was just temporary.
Hancock, though, he tried to reassure everyone. He talked about the Public Health Act of 1984 as a legal basis, but even he admitted that this new bill was taking those powers and expanding them to cover the whole UK, making them much stronger. And it seems like that 6-month review amendment, that was a big part of addressing these concerns.
Oh, for sure. It was supposed to be a safeguard, a way for Parliament to keep checking in, built right into the law. But David Davis, he asked a pretty pointed question. Would Parliament really be able to change or even reject parts of the bill at the 6-month mark? That shows there was still a lot of skepticism about how much oversight they'd actually have.
Tom Tugendhat jumped in too, and he stressed just how huge these changes were. He wanted guarantees that those powers would be used fairly and only to deal with coronavirus. He was worried about unintended consequences or misuse.
And his point is vital. Even if you have the best intentions, giving someone that much authority always carries risks. They had to make it very clear that those powers were strictly about coronavirus and nothing else if they wanted people to trust the government's response.
Jonathan Ashworth, he didn't sugarcoat it. He called these the most draconian powers ever seen in peacetime Britain. He said they could be abused and that Parliament had to be watching very carefully. So while Labour was on board with taking action, they were definitely worried about how much power the government was asking for.
Ashworth's words show the enormous responsibility Parliament felt. They knew these were unprecedented powers and that they could be misused. They understood how critical it was to have Parliament involved, holding the government accountable.
Let's move on to specific sectors. Stephen Dowdy, he asked about using these new powers to shut down places, specifically care homes, to protect those vulnerable residents. Hancock's initial response about other enforcement methods being available, it felt a little vague, but he did say he'd look into it.
This exchange, it kind of foreshadows what was going to happen, how badly the pandemic hit care homes, and the debate about whether enough was being done to protect people there. Dowdy zeroing in on care homes shows how important it was to have targeted strategies for those most vulnerable groups.
Hugh Merriman brought up the whole university situation. The guidance was confusing, with some universities telling students they had to be there even though the advice was to stay home. Hancock cleared that up, saying universities should be closed except for kids of essential workers. That was definitely needed at that point.
Right, because it showed how hard it was to take national guidance and make sure everyone was applying it the same way at the local level. Hancock's statement was an attempt to end the confusion and make sure everyone was on the same page about reducing transmission on campuses.
Stephen Dowdy had another good point about the 80% wage subsidy. What about people who were taking extra jobs, essential jobs, in food supply chains? Would that affect their subsidy? Hancock basically said, ask the Treasury, which just goes to show how complicated all of this was. Public health measures, economic measures, they were all tangled up together.
It proves that the pandemic response needed all parts of the government working together. They had to realize that economic decisions could affect public health measures and vice versa.
Munira Wilson, she was worried about social care standards being lowered and about how they decided to activate or deactivate these new powers. She emphasized that we had to think about those receiving care.
Her questions highlight how crucial transparency and accountability were. When you have these emergency powers, you have to be clear about how they're being used, especially when they could affect essential services like social care.
Caroline Lucas talked about something that was already happening. People going to holiday areas, rural places. Could they use these powers to restrict movement? Hancock said yes, they had the power to stop the spread of infection. And that became even more relevant as things went on, and different regions had different infection rates.
Yeah, that early discussion kind of predicts what came later, stricter lockdowns and travel restrictions. Hancock saying they had those powers. That meant they were ready to step in and control movement if they had to for the sake of public health.
Ian Blackford gave a really powerful speech. He talked about the pressure on the NHS in the Highlands because of all the visitors. He actually read a plea from NHS Highland begging people to stay away. And he called out those holiday accommodation providers who weren't being responsible. It was a stark picture of what happens when people don't listen to the advice.
Blackford's passion, it really brings home the impact. the real-world consequences of people ignoring public health guidance, especially in areas where healthcare was already stretched thin. Him calling people out like that, it underscores how seriously they were taking this in those vulnerable regions.
Now, the bill also dealt with managing the deceased. That's obviously a very sensitive issue in a pandemic. Chris Bryant brought up the possibility of mass funerals and suggested filming them so people who couldn't be there could still, participate.
That really highlights the social and emotional toll of all of this, how people grieve, how communities find closure, it's all affected. Bryant's suggestion shows a very practical, compassionate side, thinking about how people could still say goodbye to loved ones in such difficult circumstances.
Imran Hussein thanked the government for listening to the Muslim and Jewish communities about, ensuring dignity in death. A really important point about respecting different religious practices.
Right. It's a reminder that even during a crisis, the law and how it's applied has to be sensitive to the different cultural and religious needs of everyone.
Paul Bristow echoed that. He talked about concerns in his own community, the Muslim community in Peterborough, about cremation. He was glad the government was addressing this.
The fact that they talk about these specific religious concerns during such an important debate shows how much effort they were putting into being inclusive, respecting everyone's beliefs as part of the response.
Now, the economic side of things. The bill included things like statutory sick pay from day one and refunds for small businesses. They were trying to soften the blow economically.
Absolutely. Those were crucial first steps to minimize the disruption and offer some protection to people and businesses who were facing something they'd never seen before.
But Jonathan Ashworth, he pointed out that there were gaps in the support. What about self-employed people? What about those who didn't earn enough to qualify for sick pay? He urged the government to do more. And of course, this became a major issue, a source of real hardship as the pandemic went on.
He was right to flag those gaps early on. The initial support package wasn't enough. It became clear that they needed to do more to protect more people. Even Robert Largan, in his first speech, he focused on the problems facing the self-employed. It was a widespread concern.
Siohane McDonough brought up the issue of social isolation and how hard it was for people living in cramped housing. She had a good idea. Use empty properties to ease the pressure in those densely populated areas.
She was highlighting how these social inequalities could make things even worse during a pandemic, and she was thinking about solutions, innovative, community-based solutions to help those vulnerable populations.
John Sculler talked about price gouging, people taking advantage of the situation and raising prices on essentials. That obviously made a lot of people angry.
Yeah, it's an ethical issue, isn't it? And it might have even called for government intervention to stop that kind of exploitation and ensure that everyone had fair access to what they needed during a national emergency.
Chris Bryant brought up the self-employed again. He really stressed the need to support them, echoing what Ashworth had said.
The fact that this kept coming up, the plight of the self-employed, it shows how financially vulnerable a lot of people were right from the start.
They also talked about mental health. The impact of the crisis and how it would affect children with special educational needs. Catherine West, she asked about how they were going to review changes to mental health assessments and how they'd provide support for these vulnerable children.
That's important, right? They were recognizing that this pandemic and the measures taken to fight it, they weren't just about physical health. They had to think about mental well-being and about kids with special educational needs.
Jonathan Ashworth was really worried about them relaxing the Mental Health Act requirements. Things like letting a single doctor sign off on something that would normally need more than one. He also talked about the potential erosion of rights for children with special educational needs. That was a big concern for a lot of people, advocacy groups, individuals.
He was deeply concerned because, emergency measures, even if they're needed in the short term, they can have unintended consequences. Long-term consequences that could hurt the rights and protections of vulnerable people. Helen Hayes agreed with him, so it was a widespread anxiety.
One more thing that came up again and again in this debate was the need to be united, for everyone to pull together, and for the public to follow those social distancing guidelines they were putting in place. They used Italy as an example, as a warning of what could happen if they didn't get this right.
The calls for unity that shows they understood how serious this threat was, and they knew they had to work together to stop it from spreading. Italy, that was a powerful reminder of what could happen if they didn't act.
And even though he supported the bill, Jonathan Ashworth told the government they needed to enforce those social distancing measures more strongly. He felt like they needed to do more to make sure people complied.
His call for stronger enforcement suggests that voluntary compliance might not be enough. Maybe he saw, even back then, that they might need to be more decisive to control the pandemic.
Listening to all of this, you can just feel the pressure, the uncertainty of that moment. The decisions Parliament had to make, they had huge consequences, and they were trying to balance urgent action with protecting individual liberties and the well-being of their constituents.
The concerns they raise about PDE, testing, civil liberties, about providing enough economic and social support, Those concerns really foreshadowed the challenges that came up in the months that followed. It's fascinating to go back and see how those early discussions, how they shaped the later controversies, and how the government's policies evolved.
It's a lot to take in. What stands out to you most when you look back at this, at those early days? Do those anxieties, those priorities, do they resonate with your own experience of the pandemic? This has been just a glimpse of a deep dive into that critical moment. Keep thinking about it, about those measures they debated, about the lessons we're still learning.
Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. If you've got more sources you'd like us to explore, send them our way. We're here to help you make sense of the information that matters.